Hi, and welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. Today I'm joined by Craig Beatty. Craig is with WWF, where he leads WWF's work on the land-based hub of science-based targets for nature. He has an amazing background. Definitely check out his LinkedIn page. You'll see he's been with IUCN and a number of other organizations, been doing this for a long time. He talks a little bit in our talk about how he started as wanting to be a field biologist. And I think he does an amazingly good job of taking the complex issues surrounding biodiversity and land and place-based usage and all the different pieces of that and makes it, kind of demystifies it, makes it a little simpler. Certainly a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to him, and I think you'll learn a lot listening to him. Well worth the time. Craig, thanks for joining us. How are you today?
I'm very good. How are you?
Great. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing these days.
So my portfolio right now includes kind of three main things, but one that takes up a majority of mine. I worked for some time on the intersections between forest and human health. WWF published a report called The Vitality of Forests that looks at the evidence for connecting forest and human health. I also work a lot on kind of place-based ways to understand why we invest in different places and developing spatial tools that allow us to objectively compare why we would invest in one place versus another based on the potential of those places to deliver the types of conservation, social, or economic benefits that we're interested in delivering. And so those two things, as well as the Science-Based Targets Network's Land Hub, which I co-lead on behalf of World Wildlife Fund with Conservation International. So right now, most of my time is spent working on developing corporate voluntary methods for target setting around land. And we've just released a public consultation and soon we'll release a version 1 guidance of science-based targets for nature that include freshwater and land. And I work primarily on the land component of that.
That's fabulous. And we met at a conference at GreenBiz recently, had the opportunity to work together. I mean, all of this work, science-based targets for nature, the work on the Land Hub is really under this broad framework of biodiversity and nature, which is emerging in the corporate radar. I mean, it's been in the background for many, many years, and now it is right there next to, alongside of, and connected to climate. And in some ways, diversity and inclusion. Can you talk about like how companies are viewing this, how they're making their kind of business case for it, what they should do or what they should be thinking about as they get involved?
Sure. I think so you're right. There's a lot of movement around climate for a lot of very, very good reasons. So we have the Paris Agreement kind of was instrumental in being able for the climate work to draw a line and a trajectory for where the world needs to be. And so before that and after it, the Science-Based Targets Initiative and companies can set climate targets and can now set kind of climate targets that include emissions from land use change under the Forest, Land, and Agricultural Guidance that's come out under SBTN. But what we know about climate is that it is part of the planet, right? And so the way that we engage with nature and the way that we engage with climate, they're all part and parcel of the same thing. And so we know that there are these parallel kind of issues around climate change and biodiversity loss. And because climate change, and I hesitate to say that it's simple, because I know that all of the work around climate change is not simple. And it's taken a very, very long time to build trust around the greenhouse gas protocol and the way that companies think about emissions and climate change. But when we think about those same types of what we like to think of in terms of thresholds. So what's the 1.5 degree equivalent for nature? It breaks down very quickly because nature is much, much more complicated as a whole and much, much more place-based. And so I feel like the way that companies engage with nature, and coming from my work in health and forests, is very much the way that you or I would think about our health, right? It's something that's really personal to each of us, and something that we deal with differently. But of course, there are common things around the ways that we think about health. And so when we're trying to think about nature, we look to the science to help us understand how do we think about those components of health or those components of nature that are material and relevant for companies. And I think as companies start to understand their materiality to different components of nature, to think about how they use land, how they use water, how they rely on oceans, it comes more into focus that these aren't kind of things that need to be addressed outside of a company. They're, in a lot of cases, are absolutely central to the way that a company exists and operates. And so ignoring them or not considering them provides maybe a more short-term pathway without thinking about the long-term sustainability of a company.
I love that analogy. I mean, it's in some ways like we need to adopt delayed gratification mindsets, for human health. Like I need to think maybe I shouldn't have that hamburger tonight. And the same is true. It's an interesting analogy for companies to think about their health in that way too. I love that. And I totally agree and want to dig in a little bit more on this place-based. It's not land and water have this same problem. Like, everybody talks about water scarcity, and that's true in California, but it's not true in Quebec or whomever. It's watershed based, right? So is the same true when it comes to biodiversity and land use?
Yeah. So biodiversity, of course, is not spread evenly across the world. And the places where nature is, and you have to think about importance of nature in different ways. I think there are intrinsic importances to nature that we don't talk about because this is like a discussion around companies and how they operate, how they source and provide materials. So we don't talk about those intrinsic values. And I think setting that aside does a bit of a disservice, but it's a reality that we have to face if we want to discuss the questions of how we think about and use biodiversity. But different places provide, different resources and have different life histories. I started out in this work really wanting to be a field biologist. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go out and understand how nature works, like how do species and ecosystems interact, and really the ways that companies interact in places with the resources that are provided by different ecosystems and species is very, very different in, Arizona, Buenos Aires, or Maryland, where I am right now. And the species that are involved are different, and the ability of those ecosystems to withstand pressures is different. And that's something that we need to be very mindful of as we think about setting targets for nature, is that there's probably not going to be a global one threshold for what nature needs to rule them all. It's going to be dependent on the place, the people, and what people and nature need to thrive in those places.
Super important. You mentioned like ecosystems and the services they provide. How do you feel about or think about ecosystem services, impact weighted accounts, or, these efforts to essentially monetize the inputs we get from nature so that we can put them on a balance sheet and we can start to value them? And I know some people think that's a great idea because it transfers it into the mindset of business, and others think, no, the mindset of business is what needs to change.
Well, I am not a fan of name dropping, but I'm going to do it here because I think that it's important, because I used to be very against this. When I'm a student, when I'm thinking about the peril of nature and the, kind of mass extinction event that's happening right now, it seems incomprehensible that you would reduce nature to a value. But I took a course and got to know Tom Lovejoy, who's kind of famous for coining the term biodiversity, right? And I asked him, why are we doing this? Why are we monetizing something that should not be monetized? And what he said was, if you don't give nature a value, its value is zero. So put a value on it. Otherwise, it's worthless, right? And that's a hard reality to think about as somebody who, where kind of nature is at the core of how I think about my family's place in history in the world. But it's really true. And so if you're not thinking about it and you're not providing a value for it, then it becomes something that's not part of the equation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in fact, I think the numbers are shockingly big. I in preparation for that event that we were together at, I looked up and found $125 trillion in annual value added to human thriving or human and business thriving. That's a big number.
Well, it's an incomprehensible number.
Sure.
It's like how big the universe is. It's something that, like, the way that we can conceptualize something like the scale of the universe is like what we can see in a microscope to the view that we can see on the top of a mountain. And that's pretty much like the limit of my ability to think about space. And for $125 trillion, or like, to me, that's just incomprehensible. And so it becomes everything, right? If the number is that big, it's everything. And so let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I think that's exactly right. For companies that are starting on this path, to get engaged in biodiversity, science-based targets for nature, work with WWF or others, like, what advice do you have for them?
My advice would be first to look at the initial guidance and the guidance for how to understand science-based targets for nature. But a lot of it has to do with sourcing and understanding where ingredients come from and where ingredients are sent to. So like the trade in commodities, the sourcing of commodities, understanding that, I think, is a really great place to start. And there's lots of experience with that with climate. So looking through procurement and understanding emissions factors for the different items in a procurement list, something similar is coming for nature, where companies will be able to do that. And there probably are already lots of different ways for companies to start thinking about that. But that probably would be what I would say is the best way to start thinking about it, is to look at SBTN's initial guidance, look at SBTN's initial targets for land on no conversion of natural ecosystems, on reduction in land footprint. And the third target that we have essentially is to ask companies to start engaging in landscape initiatives. And it's it's a very loose target, but it's very important. And whereas the first two targets are thinking about your impacts and avoiding conversion of natural ecosystems or reducing the impacts of productive systems on nature, the third one is about kind of those transformative or regenerative or restorative things that we need to engage with, or that we need to understand in order to take from where we are to where we need to be. So I would say get involved in landscape initiatives that are material for your business, and SBTN will be there to provide some guidance on how to do that.
I love that. It sounds like step 1 and 2 are kind of a net zero land or biodiversity play, and step 3 is a net positive play, like go beyond. I'm a flawed analogy, I'm sure, but
essentially, it's a type of mitigation hierarchy that needs both sides. So, and I see this a lot where, I love to talk about restoration. I worked for a long time in forest landscape restoration, working with countries to understand the places that had opportunities for restoration and working with governments. So I love thinking about the places where the objectives of restoration meet the objectives of people and nature. But that's only half of the equation. If you don't address the avoidance and the reduction of impacts, then all you're doing is putting and restoration is very expensive and it's very intense and it's a lot of effort. So you want to make sure that if you're putting that effort in towards those more nature positive type activities, that they're not being undercut by things that are not avoided or things that are not reduced. So it's absolutely essential that avoidance and reduction happen in parallel or before those type of regenerative or transformative things.
It's interesting. And I think people who've been in the space a while will find it reassuring in some ways. I certainly do. It's a very similar conversation that we had about climate, about avoidance and then adaptation and mitigation and all of these different. And for a long time, people were encouraged not to think about adaptation because it was, giving up on avoidance. But it's clear we need to do both. So I think a lot of what I've heard from you and others in this space connects to ways of thinking that I've developed about corporate responsibility, sustainability, climate, what have you, that I think will make this a more comfortable journey. Because it is, as you said, it is complex, but I don't think it's entirely foreign, and people will find their footing pretty quickly.
And for customer-facing companies too, as a consumer, I'm looking for these things. If I'm buying chocolate, I'm going and seeing what's the sustainability statement on this company's website. I'm being an informed consumer about the choices that I make. And, I, for a long time, could not vote because I wasn't a citizen of the United States. And so what you learn when you're in a situation like that is that you vote with your dollars. And I vote with my dollars, and a lot of people vote with their dollars. And that it should be, and companies know this. And I think that those kinds of pressures will only continue to increase as biodiversity and nature start to take the stage more squarely.
I think that's absolutely right. So, parting question, what are you doing these days that's exciting you personally, professionally, what have you?
Well, personally, I'll say that I'll be playing my first ice hockey game next week after 3 months of having an injured knee. So that's pretty exciting to get back on the ice. And then professionally, in the next few weeks, we'll be launching the first version of Science-Based Targets for Nature, version 1. So that will go out probably towards the end of March or early April. We'll have a full official launch of the first version of Science-Based Targets for Nature, which will include guidance for companies to assess their materiality, prioritize areas for action, and then set, disclose, and measure science-based targets for freshwater and land. So I'm very excited. There'll be an initial group of companies that will be working on validating their targets over the next year. And then companies will be able to get in the queue to have their targets validated for version 1 starting early in 2024, which doesn't preclude companies from going ahead and working with the version 1 methods. But I'm very keen to see how these roll out. We've spent a lot of time across many organizations, including WWF, Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, World Resources Institute, the Food and Land Use Coalition, the Accountability Framework Initiative, and many, many more on making these targets something that are both achievable and feasible for companies to engage with, as well as ambitious enough to be called voluntary corporate targets for nature. So I'm very, very excited for that coming up soon.
That's fabulous. Well, thanks for all the work that you're doing. I think what you're doing is amazingly important, and you and your colleagues at WWF and SBTN and CI, and good luck getting back on the ice.
All right. Thanks so much, Jeff.
All right. We'll talk again soon.